Welcome everyone to another of the FutureDAMS webinar. I'll just briefly talk to you guys about FutureDAMS Consortium. We are in Manchester and we work with partners in basins and all across the world. We're working to improve the planning and governance of water, energy, food, environmental systems. And like I said, institutional case studies partners, we work with them to develop the knowledge-based tools and approach to enable resilient and sustainable development. And you can find more information about us if you go to futuredams.org. And one of our initiatives that Rose Sumner, who's our communications director, and I organized the FutureDAMS webinar series. And today we're really fortunate to have Kerry Smith and Dale Whittington with us. Kerry has had decades of experience, including professor of environmental economics at the Kerry School of Business at Arizona State, where he directed the Center for Environmental Economics and Sustainable Policy. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, University Fellow at RFF, Associate Environmental and Natural Resource Economist. I could go on forever. Dale, he is, those of you involved with FutureDAMS will know him. He gave a seminar last year as well. He's a professor of environmental sciences and engineering at the UNC Chapel Hill. And he's got decades of experience as well. Since 1986, he's worked for World Bank and other national agencies on development and application of techniques for estimating the economic value of environmental resources. And he's designed and carried out valuation studies in several countries. So between them, we've got a lot of experience and expertise in water and natural resources planning and management. And we're very fortunate to have both of them here today. And today they'll be sharing their work on the ex-ante economic analysis of investments in large dams. So I'll hand it over to you, Dale.
Well, thanks, Rohan. Kerry and I want to thank you for joining us today. As probably all of you know, large dams are controversial. They evoke strong passions among people. Some people focus on the benefits or gains of large dams, especially engineers and politicians. Other people focus on the losses, the cost associated with large dams, often sociologists, anthropologists, ecologists. If we look historically, economists have tried to seek a middle ground. They look at both the gains and the losses, the costs and the benefits from large dams, and try to find what the balance is. So for economists, some dams are good and some are bad, and the challenge is to figure out for a specific dam what the answer is. So today, Kerry and I are going to talk about the methods that economists have used to do that and how they've developed over the past several decades. And we're going to identify six developments in the ex-ante economic analysis of large dams. And our paper points out that these methods that economists use are applicable to other water infrastructure projects, as well as to the removal of dams, which is an interesting and important problem in the United States. But we're going to focus really today on ex-ante economic analysis of building large dams. And we're going to talk about these six, we call them developments. Some I think are more important than others in terms of how economists have analyzed large dams from an economic perspective. We're going to go through them one by one. Kerry and I are going to share this presentation. I'm going to make some initial remarks about each of these developments, and then I'll ask Kerry to comment. We're also going to talk about some of the ex post evidence on what the effects of water resources investments have actually been on regional economic outcomes. The ex post evidence could, in theory, inform how to do better ex-ante analysis, although I argue that most of the ex post evidence doesn't really help us do that very much. So we're going to talk a little bit about the literature on ex post analysis. So let's start with some early history on economic analysis of dams. The beginnings of modern cost-benefit analysis can be traced to Dupuy in the mid-1800s. And Dupuy discussed the measurement of the utility of public works projects and identified the area under the demand curve as the total utility associated with consuming a specific quantity of a good or service. And he suggested that these insights could be used for the ex-ante assessment of the costs and benefits of infrastructure projects like large dams. But in the 19th century, his suggestion really wasn't taken up. If you look at the history of the public debates over large dams, for example, in India and Egypt in the 19th century, British engineers discussed the relationship between water infrastructure and economic development. They argued about the consequences of what would happen if dams were built. But really, there was no agreed methodology for quantifying the costs and benefits of water infrastructure projects like large dams. And in my mind, it was more like a public debate, almost a legal trial, where you'd have proponents and people against the dam arguing different aspects of the dam. It was really a qualitative discussion. But interestingly, it did highlight the counterfactual. Way back in the 19th century, what would the future look like without new water infrastructure? So as we move into the 20th century, many of the big dams, large dams were being built in the United States with the US Bureau of Reclamation, starting a major dam construction program. And there's really no formal approach for comparing costs and benefits. That started to change in the 1930s with the Tennessee Valley Authority, when there was an extensive discussion of the multiple benefits of water resources infrastructure and their role in economic development. Note there was less of a discussion here on the losses associated with these large dams. There was a concern at the time that many of these benefits were intangible and couldn't be quantified. So from the very beginning of the application of cost-benefit analysis, there was always discussion of intangibles. What could be quantified and what couldn't be quantified with the existing economic tools. In 1934, the United States Natural Resources Board wrote of the need, the part played by intangible factors in assessing the costs and benefits of public works projects. In 1936, the Flood Control Act stated that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was permitted to participate in projects if the benefits to whomsoever they may accrue are in excess of the estimated costs and if the lives and security of people were not otherwise adversely affected. Note again, in this famous quote, the second part of that is about intangibles, the lives and security of the people not otherwise adversely affected. But this phrase in the 1936 flood control really pushed the US government to conduct ex-ante analysis of public investments. And this resulted in the development of more formal methods to actually quantify the costs and benefits of water resources infrastructure. And in 1950, the United States Federal Interagency Water Basin Committee published a famous report called Proposed Practices for Economic Analysis of River Basin Projects. This is now 70 years ago. It's this sort of famous green book. If you look on the web, you can find it, or Kerry and I can send it to you. It's really the first available set of guidelines on how to conduct ex-ante economic analysis of water infrastructure investment projects. And again, interestingly, if you look in the Green Book, you find this discussion of intangibles and how these hard to quantify consequences should be dealt with. So in the 1950s, after the publication of the Green Book, economists' interest in the economic analysis of large dams really got going. And it actually peaked in the 1950s when the US was making large investments in water storage and related infrastructure. And economists used water projects at the time as an example, a way to illustrate how public investments that were designed to accomplish multiple objectives should be evaluated. And much academic attention actually waned after the 1950s as the US made fewer investments. But in developing countries where there's little water storage on a per capita basis, the problem of how to assess costs and benefits of large dams really never went away. I want to highlight one famous publication from the 1950s because many of the issues that we're going to talk about today were foreshadowed in Otto Eckstein's Water Resources Development, the Economics of Project Evaluation. It's 1958. And he said that in this book that such purposes of water projects as recreation, he used recreation here as an example of a benefit for dams that were hard to measure. He said they must be judged on other criteria. For the use of benefit cost analysis for them is not only invalid, but casts doubt and suspicion on procedures which can effectively serve a high purpose where they're appropriate. And then he goes on to say the verbal discussion of intangible benefits and costs will communicate to Congress the facts more clearly than invalid benefit estimates. So from the very beginning here of the application of cost-benefit analysis, even the economists were arguing that intangible benefits, such as at the time recreation, should not be included in the calculation. So Kerry, I'm going to open this up for you here. This is what I wanted to say about the brief history before we get into the 6 developments. Would you like to add anything to this?
Thanks, Dale. A couple of small things just to highlight. First, can everyone hear me? Yeah, you can hear me, Dale?
I can hear you just fine, Kerry.
Okay. The first is, if we go back to the discussion of early history, that Dale mentioned the 1936 Flood Control Act. It's interesting that if you look at the quote, if benefits to whomsoever they accrue are in excess of costs, that phrase has been used multiple times to motivate and justify the Calder-Hicks potential compensation criterion that's often used in thinking about adding up benefits and costs across different groups. So that the argument being basically that if the gainers could in principle compensate the losers, this is one way the early literature and subsequent literature has gotten around the notion of compensation, to actual compensation to those that might lose. A second point that's worth bringing up, if we just look at the date of Otto Eckstein's book, which was the published version of his PhD dissertation done in, I believe, 1955. Some years before that, 8 years before that to be exact, Hotelling wrote his famous letter to the National Park Service director suggesting the travel cost method for measuring the demand for outdoor recreation. And around that same time, as we discussed a little later in the paper, actually in the early 50s, Marion Clausen and Jack Kanesh were working on the travel cost method. So it wasn't as if these things were being ignored. Methods were being developed, and this was Eckstein's view. The last issue that I want to bring up that actually parallels this Eckstein quote, which came up much later, not so much in the discussion of water projects, but also by another person who was involved in this early water literature, which is John Cretilla. John pointed out some years later, as part of his natural environments program, that vocabulary matters. The use of the word intangible in this context, as opposed to non-market, is very influential in how people evaluate what the measures might be. And John paralleled the notion that in the area of public lands in the United States, virtually all of the discussion at the beginning of his natural environments program was about undeveloped land as opposed to preserved land. So think about the difference. If you think about an area that has not yet had any transformation, if you refer to it as preserved, it has a very different connotation than undeveloped. Likewise, if you refer to something as non-market benefits as opposed to intangible benefits, there are very different implications. That's all I'll say now.
Okay, thanks, Kerry. So we're going to go into our 6 developments. These are the developments that we think have evolved since the 1950s. And the first really is adding systems analysis to the economic analysis. The seminal work here was done at the Harvard Water Program in the early 1960s and published in a famous book by Arthur Moss, The Design of Water Resource Systems, New Techniques for Relating Economic Objectives, Engineering Analysis, and Government Planning. And these systems techniques were really not part of the toolkit that Exante and the Green Book envisioned when they were thinking about cost-benefit analysis, but they enabled economic analysts to much more accurately incorporate interdependencies between different infrastructure developments on a river, as well as the actual operation of a possible dam by managers who would face a stochastic hydrology. These systems analysis techniques often enabled economic analysts to better conceptualize the counterfactual. And since 1962, there has been a very large program on adding systems analysis to the evaluation of water resources investments. This has been made possible by methodological developments in the methods, as well as increases in computing power. So this has really revolutionized the way economists think about doing economic analysis of dam projects. And of course, it's been a focus of Julian and his team in the FutureDAMS project. Kerry, do you want to say anything about the systems analysis?
Well, I think the only comment I'd make, and I think there's some discussion of this later in the paper, that initially there was a competition really between the folks in the Harvard Water Program and folks at Resources for the Future and elsewhere that were doing benefit cost analysis, where it was viewed as a competitor to benefit cost analysis. As Dale has suggested, really what it does is give us a set of tools that allow us to evaluate the consequences of large, complex infrastructure investments. And in that context, it's really a complement, not a competitor to what can be done with benefit cost analysis. But if you're interested in that debate and that controversy, there's an interesting paper by Spencer Banzaf that I believe is in our references. If it isn't, anyone can drop me an email and I'll send you a citation to it. It's in Land Economics. That's all I have to say, Dale.
Okay. So that's actually a nice segue into our second development, which is really the incorporation of multiple objectives into the appraisal of large dam projects. And this issue was addressed in the Harvard Water Program's Design of Water Resource Systems. And from the very beginning in this debate that Kerry's talking about, non-economists weren't convinced that benefit cost analysis captured all the issues that were most concerned for public sector decisions. And so the struggle has been since the 1960s, how best to incorporate these other objectives into the analysis. And so in the 1960s and 70s, the water resources community turned to multi-criteria, multi-objective approaches to policy evaluation. And there were some very influential publications at the time. In 1977, the American Geophysical Union published a monograph by David Major entitled Multi-Objective Water Resources Planning. In 1978, Jared Cohen published textbook on multi-objective planning, programming and planning that it really introduced a whole generation of engineers, economists, and planners to multi-objective optimization and planning techniques. But this was always controversial. Some economists saw this shift away from benefit cost analysis to multi-objective analysis as really a way to bypass a negative result of a benefit cost analysis. So if you got a negative result on a benefit cost analysis, but if you got a positive score on some other objectives, the decision maker might still want to move forward with a project. And that may be legitimate, but economists thought it was a way of really shifting the focus away from clear-cut negative benefit cost results. Now, the debate is a little more nuanced because one of the objectives in the multi-objective planning approach could be a cost-benefit analysis objective. It wasn't always so. Many multi-objective programming evaluations didn't include a cost-benefit objective, but it certainly could. And so this debate about the way to include a benefit cost or an economic criterion in a planning framework goes on today. And it's certainly the FutureDAMS project, we have really adopted a multi-objective framework for evaluating large dams. And we've adopted that without a benefit cost criterion. But again, this is a controversial area. And I would just say that in my own personal experience, it is rare on a large dam project that some party doesn't ask for a proper economic analysis. Because these dam projects are so controversial, it's almost always in one party's interest to raise the question of whether the benefits exceed the cost. And we'll come back to this point. Kerry, that's all I want to say about multiple objectives. Would you like to add anything?
Well, just a couple of small comments. Thank you, Dale. The first is that if we think about this in a strictly formal terms, where one has multiple objectives and thinks of this in a programming setting, that you're going to maximize one of those objectives, or you're going to select a set of weights associated with each of the objectives. If we take each of those in turn, we're going to maximize some objectives subject to a series of constraints on the other objectives. Well, the minute you pick thresholds for those constraints, you're effectively allowing the programming to decide implicit weights, because when one solves the programming problem, there will be weights assigned to the Lagrangian, the equivalent of the Lagrangian multipliers, and so you're effectively weighting them. That's the first point. The second is that most economists now involved in the debate would say that benefit cost analysis and the results thereof are never the exclusive basis for any decision. They simply provide one informational input to the process, and they allow a judgment if there are other things left out that can't be quantified. You can always ask the rhetorical question, how large would they have to be in order to overturn what the approximate efficiency criterion of net benefits yields? And that's turned out to be a very effective vehicle in many different ways in discussing the goals and the decision itself associated with any particular project. I'm done. Thanks, Dale.
Great. So the third development that we've identified is incorporating and measuring social and environmental losses. Now, losses were really never ignored. I mean, in the sense that even in the Green Book, it mentions the treatment of losses from large dams. But this issue has rarely received the attention that it deserves. Cultural, environmental, and social losses associated with large dam projects. If you look at the literature, much of it doesn't really treat this in a serious fashion. And there have been some major developments in both theory and methods on how to do this in the evaluation of large dam projects. And I'll mention the two major theoretical developments and then just allude to Kerry, the methods, and some of these Kerry's already mentioned. But John Curtilla's seminal paper in 1967 in the American Economic Review, Conservation Reconsidered, introduced the concept of existence value of a natural resource. And the reason this is important is that, as Kerry said in the history summary, if there are benefits from leaving land in a pristine condition, then there are losses associated with taking it out of a pristine condition. And those losses need to be accounted for in the evaluation of large dams. And then the question obviously is, well, how can this be measured? And since the 1960s, there's been an explosion of work on non-market valuation that can be used to identify intangible, quote, consequences of dam projects, such as the measurement of existence values. Kerry said we prefer to call this non-market consequences, but there's been a lot of work on how to do this, and we're not going to summarize that today, but that's a huge difference in terms of our ability to evaluate large dam projects today versus the tools that were available in the 1950s. So we now have a toolkit for converting Eckstein's proposed textual descriptions of non-market effects or intangibles into estimates of monetary gains and losses. The second theoretical advance came from behavioral economists and psychologists who found that when policy interventions impose losses on people, individuals value these losses much more than a comparable size gain. Jack Konech has been very influential in arguing that we really need to use measures of willingness to accept compensation to estimate these losses, not willingness to pay measures. And let me just be real clear about the implication of this. The social and environmental losses from large dams have largely been underestimated because the losses weigh heavily on the people's minds, the people that suffer these losses, much more than the comparable gains. So we've got major advances in the field in how, both theoretically and methodologically, to incorporate environmental and social losses in the assessment of large dams. Kerry, do you want to add something on this?
Yeah, just a couple of small things, Dale. One is the recognition of Curtilla's concept of existence value associated with a preserved natural resource can apply to created historic monuments as well as natural resources. And the notion is that a person has a willingness to make a trade-off to protect it in its status, in its current status, even though they wouldn't necessarily be interested in using it in any way that economists would ordinarily identify as consumption of a service. So knowing that the Grand Canyon has, in the United States, does not have impaired visibility would make any number of people feel better, and they would be prepared to make some payment for that, even though they actually wouldn't care to go see it at any particular time. And that would then be what Dale has referred to as an existence value, and we could apply that to anywhere that people know about and care about. Now, the implication of that is many-fold, and the work that Jack Kanesh and Kahneman Tversky and a number of others have pointed out, that the minute you identify these resources that people value and they don't actually have to pay for in any way, when we think about how they make trade-offs for other things, what level do you assume those are at? So if I'm making a payment for a new car or something else, what's my knowledge of other natural assets and what's going to happen to them if in the future? And does that affect my willingness to pay now for the car? That is a set of what in formal terms you'd call quasi-fixed goods that enter my preference function. And how you model those then is really what behavioral economists and psychologists are bringing up. They're basically saying to us, we need to be aware of how people perceive their endowments, what they're entitled to. And are they really entitled to that? And that may well affect the trade-offs that we measure in other contexts. And that's really a very important point. Another point that comes up once you identify these values that are associated with protecting something and you don't have to do anything to display the fact you have that value, you raise the question, how many people care? In other words, what is in formal terms, extent of the market for a preserved Kakadu or a preserved Grand Canyon? Do you count everyone in Australia? Do you count everyone in the United States? Do you count everyone in the world? It turns out Chuck Howe brought this issue up in another context many, many years ago called an accounting stance, or what we're referring to now as the extent of the market. This is just as important, perhaps more important, than the measurement of the value for a typical person. Because to think about the aggregate losses, you need to multiply by the number of people who get to count, as well as the average value we attribute to them. So I'm done.
Okay, I would just emphasize that the point Kerry made, and that the concept of existence value can apply to indigenous cultures as well. And it could be that the extent of the market for the preservation of indigenous cultures is huge. And if dam projects, large dam projects threaten indigenous cultures, I think, the current way to think about incorporating that into an economic analysis is to estimate the existence value people have for the loss of an indigenous culture. Okay, I'm going to go to the next area that methods have evolved greatly since the 1950s. And that's linking dam projects to economy-wide effects. This problem was again recognized very early on in the economic analysis of dam projects. Early proponents of dam projects often argued for the use of some kind of Keynesian multiplier to increase the direct benefits that occur in primary markets by a factor of 1.5 or 2 to estimate both the direct and the indirect benefits of projects. However, the conventional wisdom of most people practicing the economics in terms of evaluating costs and benefits of large dam projects has been to practice a partial equilibrium analysis and to assume that welfare changes in secondary markets for the most part are small. This conventional wisdom is actually codified in the United States in the Office of Management and Budget Guidelines for conducting cost-benefit analysis. But Kerry and I argue in the paper that this conventional wisdom needs to be rethought. And we really do need to take account of economy-wide linkages, but that there are two challenges that we face analytically or methodologically in terms of how to do that, at least two main ones. I mean, the first is that the economy-wide models, which are now largely computable general equilibrium models, assume that water can be moved costlessly across time and space. And for an engineer, of course, that's tough. I mean, we have infrastructure to move water from one part of a country or one part of an economy to another. We may not have the infrastructure we need to do that. And also water supplies are variable across time. I mean, and the whole point of the dam project is often to smooth out that variability. So this is a hard problem. And the FutureDAMS project is actually working on that, how to get the systems analysis models that more accurately characterize how water moves through the river and is affected by infrastructure, and incorporate that into the computable general equilibrium models of the economy. But the second challenge is probably not as widely recognized, is that the economy-wide models don't include the value of the non-market resources that we were just talking about. So once it's acknowledged that large-scale projects can have effects outside markets on non-market services, then the method used to compute the equilibrium outcomes must incorporate these non-market effects as influences to that equilibrium. There is some literature on this, and Kerry has been influential in the development of these methods, and we cite that literature in the paper. And as I said, this is an active area of research in the FutureDAMS project, is how to incorporate these economy-wide linkages and really link the systems analysis models of the river hydrology and infrastructure to the economy. Kerry, would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, this is, as Dale suggested, a very big topic, and I could easily get carried away in talking about it. So I'm going to try and discipline myself on this one, Dale, and just say three things. The first is, in contrast to market goods and services, environmental services simply don't enter the national income and product accounts. Okay, so we just don't have a consistent basis for keeping track of the services that are provided by natural resources and how they might vary from one country to the next. Now, the UN and a number of agencies at various times tried to initiate these projects, and to be honest, they are largely stalled at this point. Richard Carson and I, working with the Sloan Foundation and EPA, are trying to go to the group that originally started the design of the national income and product accounts and begin to get them thinking about that. But until we have a consistent basis for keeping track of these data and incorporating them along with market data on goods and services, it's going to be very hard to go further. The second, Dale already mentioned, is the role of the spatial dimensions of economic activity and environmental activity and somehow coordinating them. We don't do a very good job of that now at all. And it rarely comes up except in the most micro of discussions, and we need to have it come up in the way we design and use these models. And the last issue goes back to the one we were talking about before. In the computable general equilibrium models, you're setting out a specification for what motivates people. What is their a representative person's preference function, and what arguments should be in that preference function? Well, if we take Jack Kanesh and Danny Kahneman and Tversky and other behavioral economists' arguments, there should be endowments that are perceived as important, whether they are natural or cultural, that people would be prepared, if given a choice, to do something about. Well, how do we enter those into the functions? How do we deal with them in these models? These are unanswered questions, and therefore they're opportunities for the next generation of scholars. I'm done.
Okay. Let's go to the fifth development. We talk about this as modeling non-cooperative behavior. If you go back to the early work by systems analysts, they were really focused on how to optimize the economic benefits of water resources infrastructure. And they assumed that the state would seek to design, build, and operate infrastructure that was in the best interest of all parties involved. This is not how political actors make decisions in the real world, especially on transboundary rivers. And economists recognized this early on. And Peter Rogers and others started to apply game theory concepts to modeling shared water resources. Analytically, the application of game theory to water resource systems really paralleled the development of the multi-objective evaluation, the programming approaches. And instead of the multiple objectives for a single decision maker, game theorists ask how the outcome realized by multiple decision makers, each potentially motivated by different goals, would compare with a system-wide efficient choice. So these game theory models have been widely developed and published in the academic literature. I would say they haven't had that many practical applications, but I would make the point that they really highlight that the conflicts involved, in especially transboundary river basin management problems, really make the cost of the dams much more costly, much higher. The pictures of the dam that I have shown in the upper right corner throughout this presentation are the Ethiopian Grand Renaissance Dam that Ethiopia is building now near the border with Sudan. And this has been hugely controversial. And none of the cost of this controversy are incorporated into the economic analysis of the costs and the benefits of the dam. Kerry, would you like to say something else about the game theory applications?
Well, just that this is an alternative methodology for dealing with the conflicts that we discussed in the sum of the other four developments. That is, ultimately decisions get made, and whose rights get to count, and how we represent that process is important. And one of the reasons I believe why the non-cooperative game theory models haven't had as much impact as they might is they haven't come to constructive recommendations as to yet. So this is another fruitful area for research, as Dale said, that they highlight the conflicts, they highlight the fact that who decides matters and how the decisions can matter. We can get outcomes that we would really have preferred not to happen. And so the question is, how do we design the rules to avoid that? And we haven't yet gotten to the equivalent of a green book in how to think about that, but it's clearly an opportunity.
Great, thank you. Last one of our developments is really the techniques that are used to deal with uncertainty. And here, from an ex-ante cost-benefit analysis, we're really talking about uncertainty in two ways. The first is obviously the results themselves are uncertain. The cost-benefit models used to evaluate large dams may have dozens, hundreds of parameters. Each of those parameters is uncertain. And the results of the cost-benefit analysis really should be viewed as a probability distribution given the uncertainty around those parameters. This was recognized early on in the analysis of dams when a great attention was focused on the discount rate. and the uncertainty associated around the discount rate really had a huge impact on the economic outcome of large dams. But the second area in which uncertainty affects ex-ante cost-benefit analysis is maybe less well recognized, is that people make their choices under uncertainty, and the cost-benefit calculations actually need to reflect the fact that people's values or the policy for the dam are affected by the fact that the outcomes are uncertain. They're not guaranteed. So we have a lot of developments in ways of handling uncertainty for large dams over the last several decades. Some are quite standard now, the Monte Carlo analysis, simulations with stochastic hydrology are standard tools in engineers and economists toolkits. Probably less used are real options analysis and decision-making under deep uncertainty. My own experience with this in trying to, I did the economic analysis for the World Bank on the Grand Ethiopian dam, was that it's very hard to communicate these results to decision makers. So on the one hand, we have lots of new techniques, but we struggle to find better ways to communicate the complexity in these uncertain results. Kerry?
Yeah, again, this is an area for a future research for sure, as Dale suggested. I would highlight three aspects of the points that Dale made. The Monte Carlo analysis and the simulation with stochastic hydrology often have to do with either the estimation uncertainty, that is, we don't know some of the key parameters, so we try to characterize the distribution of outcomes recognizing that estimation uncertainty, or the process itself is stochastic, and we try to describe it in a way that reflects that uncertainty. That's one set of issues. Separate from that set of issues is most benefit cost analysis has to rely on existing estimates. We can't go out usually and do new research on the benefit side. So we're looking for measures that we can somehow adapt. And often in that adaptation, we assume what the policy delivers is guaranteed. And people, more importantly, that people perceive it as being guaranteed, perhaps guaranteed within a range based on the simulations or something else. But if people don't feel that way, if they recognize that really that may not happen, then the way we're calculating the trade-offs they would make is really not correct, and that needs to be modified. And so the question really becomes not so much what's the best number, but how large does the uncertainty have to be before we have to worry about it, people's values being different. And I think that that question is answerable, and we can develop bounds on that. And that's, again, an area worth thinking about. The last point is the one that Dale made, which is how do we explain these results? The people who are best trained in all of the 4 items, from Monte Carlo analysis to decision making under a deep uncertainty, are pretty sophisticated folks. And the way they think about problems is often different from the way that the policymakers and ordinary people think about the problems. So years ago, EPA had a big effort in a completely different context in risk communication. And we need to rethink those very issues and ask, you know, what's an appropriate vehicle? It may be that we all think in terms of confidence intervals or probabilistic representations, and you go to the average member of a town council or a mayor and tell them, well, you just need to put this in a 95% confidence interval, and this is the band, and we bootstrap this to get this standard error, and they say, well, I don't wear boots. And then it goes downhill from there. And this is not to be critical of the mayor or the town council. It's to suggest that it's our problem, not theirs. They could understand it if we used a different vocabulary. And that's really important. I'm done.
Okay. So we're going to wrap this up. That is our 6 developments that we've identified in sort of how the methods for doing cost-benefit analysis for large dam projects have evolved. I want to say just one last thing, about the ex-post evidence. Kerry and I'll comment on that, maybe, and then wrap up, and then we should have about 30 minutes for questions. So I think it's important to look at this ex-post evidence on what has actually happened when large dams have been built. Conceptually, this information should be useful in terms of helping us understand what the benefits would be ex ante for new dam projects. And there's really 2 types of ex post evidence in the literature. The first is how did the direct benefits attributed to a project's outputs and cost align with what was estimated ex ante? In other words, look at a particular dam, look at the ex ante analysis, and then redo it ex post to see actually what happened. There are really very few of those studies available. The second type of ex post analysis focuses on the effects of the project on overall economic activity at a regional or national level. This analysis might not have been included in the ex ante analysis. There's 2 literatures here that we've identified. Many of you may be familiar with the new literature started by Duflo and Pandy, published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. We have research on that ongoing in the FutureDAMS project, redoing some of that work of Duflo and Pandy. But there is an old literature that we discuss that grew out of the initial concerns about general equilibrium effects. And this is largely published in the late 60s and early 70s. And what we conclude here is that researchers have used different research designs and measures of economic outcomes, and that economies themselves that are studied are very different. So we conclude, we don't really believe that the results of these ex post studies support any generalizable conclusion on how water projects affect economic growth. In other words, are water projects good? Are they bad? Do they promote growth or not? They can do different things in different contexts. Kerry, do you want to say something about the ex post evidence?
Well, I think that a lot of the focus of the new literature that Dale cited is about statistical identification of the effects. So they're typically taking what we might call reduced form models and say, can we really identify the effect and attribute it to these particular investments? And as the last bullet in this ex post evidence that Dale has prepared highlights is, in that process of isolating an effect and assuring we've measured it correctly, it's all about instruments. Are you correctly measuring something that is correlated but exogenous, not determined at the same time as the outcome you're trying to explain? That's certainly very, very important. It's also important not to forget the economics of this. That is, when you have measured the effect, what do you do with it? What does it mean in terms of how we might use it to evaluate methods, ex ante methods in the future? and there seems to be less interest in that. That was clearly a much more important issue in the early literature that Dale talked about, and I think it would be productive to return to those issues in parallel with the issues associated with the selection of instruments. That's it, Dale. Thank you.
I just want to emphasize a point Kerry made. A lot of a lot of the focus on this recent literature has been on the average treatment effect of mini dams. So what do you do with that? I mean, it's of interest if you have thousands of dams and the average treatment effect is slightly positive or slightly negative. But what we really want is to be able to use that for the in an ex-ante analysis for the dam that we're looking at. And it may well be that we don't want our dam to have the average treatment effect, but something much better. I guess we can conclude, Kerry, just with some remarks about where the field stands in terms of new developments. I mean, there really isn't any place that a practitioner can go now to see all of these 6 developments incorporated into an ex-ante analysis of a dam project. So what we've said in the paper is that there really needs to be a new level of engagement between academics and practitioners on how dams are evaluated. You know, that's how we wrap up. Kerry, do you want to just sort of say anything else about the conclusions?
I just want to echo what Dale said in the early days of this work, the days in which Eckstein and Krutilla and Dorfman and others were working. This was an exceptionally exciting area for research. I'm not saying that mainstream economists were as engaged as those individuals, but they gradually became engaged as the quality and character of that research expanded. Now, if one looks at where the attention and benefit cost is right now and methods, it's largely associated with regulations as opposed to public investments. So, and an important leadership role here is EPA. But EPA's role is developing methods that are practical, that can be done within the time horizon that they have for regulation, and less methodological. And so there isn't, at least right now, an advocate for a revisiting domestically, or as far as I can tell, internationally, the methods that are used to do ex-ante investment analyses, whether in water projects or in other infrastructure. And yet we know the world, both developed and developing, at some point is going to turn its attention to greater investments in infrastructure. So there's an opportunity here, but I don't see a community or a commitment to the development of methods as there was at this particular time.
First of all, I'd like to thank Dale and Kerry for a very comprehensive and relevant presentation. Thank you so much. In lieu of an applause that you would be in an on-person seminar, I'd just like to thank you. And everyone attending, we are trying to do these seminars once every 2 weeks. If you go to FutureDAMS.org, we've got a tab up there for our seminars. And the next one's going to be in 2 weeks from now. And I'll be presenting some of our work, the FutureDAMS Agricultural Economics team, from our work in Ghana. And there's some comments on the chat box as well. I'll send those over to you, Dale and Kerry. Again, yeah, thank you so much for the presentation.
Thank you for hosting us.
Yes, thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Thank you for the active participation as well.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.